said to the nurse at the time, I was like, why are you taking my blood? And she goes, that's how we test for HIV. And I was like, I remember being on a date with someone. I need to tell you something. Like, I'm HIV positive. And I remember he like looked at me and it was like I murdered him.
I really think the only thing that makes it so stigmatized too is the fact that it's associated with sex.
They could totally have something that's just
100%.
like they're unaware of.
Safer sex practices aren't happening. It's changed the way I look at sex. Why do I want to have sex with someone who doesn't want to respect me?
Ooh. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Queer Collective podcast. I'm your host, Carbon.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Myles.
And welcome to the show. And this episode is presented by Vizzy Hard Seltzer and DoorDash, but more on that later.
From the early days of the AIDS epidemic to the ongoing struggles faced by those living with HIV, the queer community has long been at the forefront of this health crisis, and today we're going to cover it all. Alongside our lovely guest, Myles Sexton, we'll dive into the history of the AIDS epidemic, explore the firsthand experience of being HIV positive, we'll discuss the ongoing stigma and discrimination, and of course, leave you off with dating advice and HIV sex education.
And with us today, we have Myles Sexton, who is a multi-talented creative director, stylist, and makeup artist known for their impactful work as an HIV, AIDS, and sobriety activist. As a non-binary and queer fashion nomad, Myles brings a unique perspective and vibrant energy to the fashion industry. They are also a prominent TV regular and the engaging host of the acclaimed podcast, Our Private Bits. Myles, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I finally made it here.
Finally.
So before we get into this episode, we really want to give our readers a bit of a primer in terms of the history behind the AIDS epidemic and its connection to the queer community. So I'm going to take a second to do that, and then we're going to jump into our conversational section of this episode.
Yes.
The 1980s to 90s was the peak of the AIDS epidemic. And if you're familiar with queer history, you know that this crisis disproportionately impacted the gay community. In the USA alone, by 1995, 1 gay man in 9 had been diagnosed with AIDS and 1 in 15 had died. It was a literal decimation of an entire cohort of gay men. Unfolding in an intensely hostile environment towards the queer community, the disease stigmatized gay men further, with President Reagan and the media treating it with apathy and humor, referring to it as the gay plague and labeling individuals with the disease as immoral. Due to a lack of knowledge around how AIDS spread and stigmatization around homosexuality, gay men, even men suspected of being gay, lost their jobs. They were even evicted from apartments and they were ostracized. Newspapers carried earnest stories about the risk of catching AIDS from a toilet seat in the public restroom. Funeral homes refused to handle bodies, and hospitals turned patients away or placed them in isolation. There was talk of quarantining the sick in a modern-day leopard colony and tattooing the infected to warn prospective sex partners of the danger.
But thanks to direct action campaigns like Silence Equals Death and strong advocacy from the queer community, we saw groundbreaking medical advancements that transform HIV from a death sentence into a manageable condition. But the story doesn't end there. HIV/AIDS continues to disproportionately impact people of color, the queer community, and those living in poverty around the world, and these groups face ongoing systemic inequalities, stigmatization, and barriers to healthcare. For this reason, we're keen to dive deeper into this topic today, and we want to celebrate Myles for courageously sharing their HIV status publicly and joining us today for this vulnerable conversation. The advocacy you do is so critical to the ongoing shift of public dialogue and empowering others who are also living with HIV. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here.
The place that we want to start is really with your personal journey.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you'd be able to share with us your story about being diagnosed with HIV.
Absolutely. So at that time in my life, I think I was 26, almost 27. I was working as like a global makeup artist for Lancome, and I was traveling all over the world. It was super cool. I was in a long-term relationship, and I had been sick for like a really long time. And I just couldn't figure out like why I was so sick. And it would just it would come in sort of waves of like, if I would get the flu, it would last like weeks, or like colds would just like knock me on my ass. So I was doing like a lot of testing and trying to figure out like what was going on with me in that relationship. Things were a little bit turbulent, and I had ended up cheating like on my partner, and the person that I cheated on him with like contacted me and said like, oh, like I tested positive for like an STI, like you should probably go get tested. So I went and got tested. Like, I guess maybe like 3 or 4 days later, I was at work, and the like walk-in clinic like contacted me. And they were like, oh, like you're HIV positive, like over the phone.
Oh, wow.
Are they supposed to do that?
No, like this is like so not the protocol that you do. And the doctor's like, I don't really know much about HIV, but like
Clearly.
I just like it's a long weekend and like I felt like you should know. So like you might want to like go to the emergency or like go like see someone who can give you more information than I can. It was like one of those things like, 'cause I was like literally in the middle of teaching a class. And so like I don't know how, like I just like removed myself from who I was and like just finished teaching. And then like I remember getting into my car and just like everything just like felt so blurry and like I just like started like losing it. And I don't know how. I was in Niagara Falls. I like somehow like drove back to Toronto. It was so hard for me to see the road because I was crying so much. I knew that my partner was going to be home from work and then like I was going to have to tell them. How was I going to tell them?
Yeah.
You know? And like we were sort of in this long-term relationship. We didn't have conversations about having an open relationship, but I also like didn't want to tell them that like I cheated on them and like
It's a lot to tell all at once.
it was just like it was like everything. But I also like the person that contacted me, like he wasn't the one who gave it to me.
So he had a different STI.
He had
was
a
contacting
completely
you about.
different STI that I didn't end up getting, but like it allowed me to go get tested. And after all of this, I figured out that the walk-in clinic that I was going to get tested in was the same one that I went like since I moved to Toronto when I was like 18 going on 19. And they never took my blood. When I went to the walk-in clinic that was close to my work that day, because I got the text message, I was like, oh, there's one downstairs. I'll just try out this walk-in clinic. They took my blood. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's really weird. So I said to the nurse at the time, I was like, why are you taking my blood? And she goes, that's how we test for HIV. And I was like, fuck. Because I knew, I think in the back of my mind, I was like, that's probably why I've been so sick for so long.
Oh, no. So do you think you had like an inkling right away?
Yeah, I kind of did, but it like, you know, I didn't really want to acknowledge it. And then like based off of the blood test that I got afterwards, my specialist was like, you know, you've definitely been like living with HIV for a long time because of just like how many copies of the virus was in my body. Like that's not someone that would just have it for a week. It wouldn't spread that fast. I had gotten tested for regular STIs, but thinking that I was getting tested for HIV right as we like officially made things official in my relationship. And then
so it actually happened before your relationship.
It happened before my relationship, but then like, okay, so now I have to tell my partner. I also like don't know if they have it as well. And it was just like, oh my God, it was like just the most traumatic thing that's ever happened in my life on so many levels, you know, because it's just like, I felt like my whole world just like fell apart. I left my job. I was just like, I couldn't focus on anything other than just trying to like heal, I guess.
What was that emotional coping process for you like, and physical coping process? Because it obviously takes a toll on your body. Like what was that journey like for you?
Totally. I think a lot of traumatic things have happened to me in my life. And I feel like when they do happen, I go to this like place where I'm like so hyper focused on like making it better, but like in not a healthy way. Like I just like, I'm like, oh, I need to like functionally be better and I need to like present that everything's fine. And like, I can't let people see this like weakness of myself. He didn't end up getting HIV, which is wonderful. And I'm, you know, I'm glad that because I would feel so guilty if like unknowingly I gave that to him. But like, I felt like I was just going about the world not as myself. And I was such a like a shell of myself, you know, at that time. And I lost so much weight and my hair started falling out. Like it was just like manifesting in so many like different ways of just how like unhappy I was, you know, just trying to like pretend that everything was fine. Yeah. But I also like, it's weird. Like when you get diagnosed, like, I don't know, it made me like a bit paranoid because I felt like everyone was going to find out. And I was like, like, how are they going to know? Are they going to find out? Like, are they going to be able to tell, you know, like, I don't know. It was weird. I just thought about that so much that I was just trying to like cover it up.
Hyper focused on it.
Yes.
So you're like, everybody must know. Everybody sees it too.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's a virus that doesn't have any like really physical signs until it turns into AIDS. Yeah. So, but every time I got a little like red dot or a pimple, like I was like, oh my God, do I have AIDS? Yeah. You know, or like I remember once I was like at my parents' house and I was like, are they going to find my medication? I was so afraid. I was always hiding my meds. I had cut my hand or something and my sister like tried to like wipe it off of my leg with like a thing. And I like I was like, no, don't touch it. You know, like, but I was like, there's no way I could give her anything, but it was just like this paranoia and my own stigma, you know, of just like being in that sort of first year of living with it.
Was it liberating for you to come out publicly and you're like, okay, everyone knows now? It's like, it's kind of a weight off of your chest.
Oh, absolutely. Like I just needed it. You know, the pandemic helped a lot. It stopped me from running away from it. I ended up moving into another role, another job that I traveled like every week. So it was like the pandemic stopped me from being able to travel. And I think I like really numbed with traveling. And so then it like forced me to get uncomfortable and sit with myself and have these like really uncomfortable conversations. And then so I could publicly talk about it. It was just like, okay, like this is like, you no longer have power over me. It felt so liberating.
How has your perspective on life changed since your diagnosis?
Oh my gosh, so much. You know, it's like, that's the thing is like, I think when really horrible things happen to you, you know, you can either go like one of two directions. You can either let this like one thing really destroy you and you can like sit in that, or you can like use it to motivate yourself to like push yourself forward. And, you know, once I finally got out of this thing of letting it sort of destroy my life, I was able to like get onto this path of like, okay, like I this is so motivating for me. And it just like allowed me to get to know myself on such a deep level that like, I can't even tell you like how much joy has come from it, you know, and it also has like encouraged me to like, now I'm 6 years sober, and like all of these like things that I really like struggled with for such a long time, it just like allowed me to be the best version of myself. And I feel like I can be the best partner. I can be the best like version of my friendships now. And I have just such a good relationship with myself that I don't regret what happened as much as it was very traumatic.
Yeah. How long did it take you from like the initial moment of understanding the diagnosis to the moment of like, okay, I want to be public with this. I want to heal. I want to stop numbing.
It was about 3 years for me to like really get to this place. I remember like publicly coming out about my sobriety like the year before, and I was like, I'm gonna dip my toe into this and see how the response is of like sharing something vulnerable.
Do you still like me?
Like just the world still like me. And then like, you know, that was such a positive experience. And then this was just like, okay, it kind of helped prepare me for the real big one. For me anyway.
And then the response was like very positive.
So positive. Like I don't even think I got like one bad like comment.
During those 3 years, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced before like coming to that more like self-acceptance place?
Yeah, I think like having conversations with like people in my life, just because I knew that I was going to publicly come out about this, you know, and I felt like I owed them some like respect of like having a one-on-one conversation about this before I publicly came out, you know, but I think it's really hard when like you are a public person, like a public figure like myself, and like a lot of like my biological family is not like, I don't share a lot of like who I am with them, and they haven't earned that, you know, but I knew that like me coming out about this, like they would hear about it and then they would have a lot of like feelings and reactions to it. It was really like difficult trying to have like those conversations with those people in my life, like my grandmother and my mom and my dad and my siblings. And it went a lot better than I thought it would. Like they were all like generally understanding. Like literally when I told my mom, she was like, "What's HIV?" Like she had no idea.
Really?
I just remember like sobbing and like, "I have HIV." Like she's like, "What's that?"
What's that? And you're like, "Oh, wait.
Okay.
Hold on. Let me get my
rewind
notes."
Totally. Like she just like, you know, had no preconceived like idea of it. So
Which I guess helps, like there's no stigma
there was no
either.
stigma, so I just had to like explain it to her. They're like, "Oh, it's like kind of like a virus that affects my immune system, but if I take like medication, I'm totally fine." Just like, okay. I think the hardest was like people who, you know, like I had more like sexual or like romantic connections with and like was public about that online, that I think had the most issues with me like publicly talking about it, because they felt like it was gonna like people would wonder if they also had it. And I think that that's where like a lot of those hard conversations sort of came up from.
But I think that really goes to show like the stigma though. Like that if say you're dating somebody that has it, then like you're automatically assumed that you do too. And I think that there's like not enough information that is shared and that is known like for just like the average person. Things like prevented, like treated, and like just live with it or live with somebody who has it.
Yes.
Like, there's
also just like likelihood of it spreading in certain different cases too.
Totally.
It's like it's not always 100% certain the way that people think it is.
Exactly.
And for our listeners, we are going to get into like clearing that up at the end of the episode, so stay tuned for that. I was wondering if you could finish off this section by giving us some advice for someone who's recently been diagnosed with HIV.
Absolutely. I think like one of the biggest things that helped me was like finding a medical professional that you connect with and don't feel like you have to, like, the first person that you get diagnosed with has to be your person that treats you for the rest of your life. The first person that I went to see that was even like an HIV specialist, like, we just didn't vibe. I felt like they treated me like a barcode, and like I didn't appreciate that. And like I understand that they probably see hundreds of people every single day that like live with HIV, but like it was my first experience.
It's deeply personal and vulnerable.
Totally, you know, and like I needed some empathy, and there just wasn't that. And then I end up finding, shout out to Dr. Gian at the St. Michael's Family Health Center, and she just like transformed my experience with healthcare, using my right pronouns, just like using the right language, you know, like just when it came to like sex. And it was just like, I felt like she like taught me how to feel empowered when going to a doctor. And I really try to recommend to people now, like, please interview your doctor and see if it's the right fit for you. And if they give you advice, like, you can challenge it if it doesn't feel like it fits for you. And I really had to do that, you know, in this situation. So I feel like that's a huge part. And then I think everyone just like needs to read like all of Brene Brown's books. I feel like those books helped me so much just on talking about like shame and vulnerability and courage. And I wasn't having any of those conversations with myself prior to being diagnosed. And I feel like those are two like really big ones.
Absolutely. Yeah. You touched on coming out to family as well. Do you have any advice for people coming out with HIV?
Absolutely. Like, I think, you know, it's not a race. Yeah. And like, I think probably your situation is going to be different than like mine, where like I had to publicly come out about it online and like come out to the people who you feel like it's going to be safe with. I think a lot of people will project their emotions and feelings and expectations like onto you in that moment. And if like you're not prepared to have that conversation, like you shouldn't be telling them. Within that first year, I was so vulnerable and just like so just weak and fragile. And I was like trying to have those conversations. And I felt like a lot of those conversations like hurt me so much
Reopen
more.
The wound.
Exactly. And it was just like reliving it over again. And that I wish I would have given myself more time to just like be in a better place with who I was before I had those conversations. And like, honestly, like, I don't think I needed to have a lot of them with some certain family members. Like, if they don't talk to me, like, why am I reaching out to tell them this? Like, I really don't care if they see it on Facebook, you know, or whatever. So
the next section that we really want to dive into is stigma and discrimination with HIV and AIDS. So you do a lot of advocacy work for HIV/AIDS.
Yes.
And with your experience, where do you think that public perception of the disease is, and how far do we still have to go?
There's so many pockets with like who knows what. I think that within the queer community, there's a lot more like funding that is like creating awareness campaigns around prevention and just like what U equals U, or like undetectable means untransmittable. You know, there's a lot of that. But there's also like a lot of sub minorities of our community that don't know, you know, as well. And then I think for like the whole everyone else who doesn't fall under our umbrella, like honestly, people don't know about it unless they like lived through the 80s and were old enough to see it on the news. You know,
even then what they do know is probably a lot of incorrect information
100%.
that's like highly stigmatized too.
Yeah, and it was like advertised, for lack of a better word, as like a gay disease specifically. So if you're like straight or you know, in a straight relationship, etc., you think that you can't catch it, or it's not possible because it's like a gay thing, but that's not true.
It's not true. Did you know that like 1 in 3 newly diagnosed cases in Canada are in people who identify as women? It's now for the first time in like newly diagnosed cases that it's like exceeded people who identify as men. Like it's literally like in Canada no longer like a gay man's disease. I'm using air quotes. You know, like it's really isn't. And then unfortunately it's also like super disproportionate. Like I think it's over 40% of those newly diagnosed cases are also in Indigenous people. So it's just like it's really like it's unfortunate that like every single year in Canada we're only increasing versus decreasing. And that's scary. Like there's countries around the world that have like way higher populations than we do, and they're decreasing the newly infected rate, and we're only growing. The government does not put enough like funding into it. Like
Yeah.
the government literally funded HIV self-testing kits for 1 year and then pulled all of the funding for it this year.
Also, I feel like just in general, like our sex education system is like terrible.
100%.
You don't really learn anything. You just learn that like you can reproduce.
Yes.
Like that is, it's like, okay, well, what else you got?
Totally.
There's nothing about like sex, safety, healthcare,
No.
safer sex,
Yes.
like any of that. And I do see a lot of like, I visit the Safer Sex Clinic, like often just like, you know, do testing or whatever the case, whatever you need. And I go in there, there's so many pamphlets about everything that you want to know about like sex, health, education, safety, but we don't see that in other clinics.
100%.
We don't really see
it should
that
be everywhere.
With the stat that you shared, is it because the number of like men who have sex with men being newly diagnosed, is that number decreasing?
It is because of that so many like men who have sex with men are on PrEP now.
Yeah.
So like we are seeing the benefits of like
Information
people being on
campaigns.
PrEP and like the access to that. You know, now there's a lot more people who can access it like for free and like, you know, there's ways sort of around it because it's very expensive. You know, people don't realize like even
It's like $200 a month, right?
like and that depends on your like drug plan. Like even for like when I was on pills, my pills cost me $4,000 every 3 months. And like so when I quit my job, I had to pay for that out of pocket. And there was no coverage.
Life-saving medication too.
It's bananas. So there's a lot of like barriers around access to this. You know, it's getting a lot better. You know, you have like companies like Freddie who are like an online company as well that you can literally just like sign up online. You get you get to talk to a doctor virtually and like they'll get you on it. You know, and like, you know, the Safer Sex, there's like the PrEP clinic. There's so many of these like more places opening up, but it's tough.
And I think the thing to emphasize there too is like a lot of what we're talking about are resources that are available in Toronto and the biggest city in Canada. And in researching this episode too, there's a lot of like really great Vice documentaries on HIV AIDS, especially like around America, but in poorer states, especially like within religious communities, within like BIPOC communities, especially the Black community, it's like there's a lot of misinformation happening. There's a lot of shame still happening. There isn't very much access, even just in terms of like people being in rural communities, being able to like physically access clinics.
Totally.
And with all of the information that we have, no one should be dying of AIDS. No one should be living with HIV unmedicated. Like this is life-saving medication that everyone should have access to.
Totally.
Speaking of all the harmful misconceptions, I'm wondering if we can do some like myth busting right now. And if you can mention some of the most harmful misconceptions and then like bust that myth right after it.
Love it. I love it. So, you know, one you mentioned earlier is like toilet seats. It's like literally impossible for you to get HIV from a toilet seat. Yeah. Also, like spit is another one. Like people think that you can get HIV from spit. You would literally need to drink like gallons and gallons of spit for it to like even maybe be able to get it.
And what I learned is because it can't live outside of the body.
No.
And that is such an important piece of information that everyone should know is like, hello.
The biggest thing with HIV though is that, you know, it's like, it's really like, it's blood to blood is how it really will infect you, you know? So I think for a lot of people that what they don't realize sometimes is like, if you don't have a tear or like the fluid isn't able to get into your body, like it's not able to be absorbed, like you're not going to be able to get it, you know? So it's not as easy as people sometimes think, you know, it is. And I think it goes back to too of just like using safer sex practices and that includes lube. You know, I think a lot of people don't realize that, but if you are using condoms and like and you're using spit, oftentimes like spit, there's like it's like a digestive that's in it, like an enzyme that's in your spit that like can actually break down the tissue of you know, of your hole. So it actually can like open up like more risk of like being infected with all types of STIs. So using proper lubes is important.
Good information.
That is really good information. I didn't know that one.
The other one, I'm going to like feed them to as well.
I love it.
Only men who have sex with men can contact the
Totally. Not true. As you heard earlier, you know, really anyone can get it.
Yeah. So anyone who is sexually active or sharing contaminated needles is really at risk. Like it's not just men who have sex with men. Another one is HIV shortens your lifespan.
Yeah. I mean, not true at all. Like, and it's so funny now because, you know, I'm so hyper fixated on my blood work and just like how my body is like functioning, you know, because I feel like I've gotten this sort of second chance, I guess. And it's so interesting to see how unhealthy I was prior to getting HIV. And now like my doctor, like he'll like look at my charts and he's like, you have like the health of like a teenager, you know, like 'cause you're like taking your health so seriously.
You're
And
aging
like,
backwards.
Exactly. I'm like,
Benjamin Button over here.
I love
it. So it's definitely not true. I think it's just like one of those big things is like, because of the medications, you just have to be like more aware of like your cholesterol levels and things like that. But
you should like also probably be aware of that.
Anyone should be. So exactly.
So it's actually like, it's so fascinating and I find it insightful and inspiring that it's actually like made you take such good care of your health.
Totally.
That you're Benjamin Button. You're aging backwards and you're in like such great shape. You know, I feel like most people, including myself, unfortunately, are like really good at letting their health deteriorate until it's like,
I'm so good at it.
Totally.
So great at this, but
agreed.
No, but I like allow myself to hurt until it's like unbearable. And then I'm like, okay, what are we going to do about this?
It's true. It's a coping thing too, I think.
Yeah,
right?
totally. But I feel like we're also a little bit taught to do that.
Yes.
Like, I don't know. I think for me, I pinpoint it to like being in dance or like being a video editor, even like where you just like put yourself through like long hours of things that are kind of like, you know, like not great for your body. Like sitting isn't great for your body, or like as a dancer, you just like go again and again and again and you allow yourself to get injured.
Totally.
But that can go for anything. Like if you're in sports, like you also have that kind of a mindset. And I feel like we often learn how to push ourselves past our limits, but we don't often learn how to listen to our bodies and what it's trying to tell us.
Exactly. How do we take care of ourselves?
Totally.
It's like another big learning of life, I think.
Absolutely. So the next piece that I want to get into is that worldwide, people of color, especially queer people of color, are also at higher risk of contracting HIV. And I'm wondering if you have any insight on why this might be.
I think it comes down to just the access to care and like, and the funding that goes behind that, right? And there's also just like a lot of like stigma. In Canada, you know, when we look at like HIV, I think oftentimes, again, it comes down to it's like very much like it looks like a white male and that's where all of the funding is going. It's like when you look of like where the access to all of like the clinics and stuff are, most of them are close to the village and, you know, but like within, you know, the BIPOC community, homosexuality or like being part of our umbrella doesn't always necessarily mean that. And, you know, there's a lot of people that come either as like an immigrant or like they're coming here like under asylum that they grew up in countries where, you know, HIV is so much more prevalent. You know, when I go to the World AIDS conferences and I look at like what they're doing in Africa versus like what we have here, they're like life years like ahead of us, you know, in terms of like access and treatment and like their systems that they have set up because so many people are living with HIV there. It's just unfortunate that in Canada and in the US too, that there's still not a lot of like the funding is going to opening clinics or like creating easier access for these communities. And I wish that it needs to happen.
Yeah. There seems to be a pattern in terms of like where funding goes or where government money or like taxpayer dollars go. And across the board, it's just not common that it goes to low income people, to BIPOC people, to people that are marginalized and just queer people in general. Like it often goes to those that are either like cis or straight or rich or etc. And that's not where the aid needs to go. It needs to go to the people that actually need it, but that's not the case.
I think, again, it also comes down to like, who are we bringing to the table to have these conversations? Like when we're opening clinics, like why are we choosing to open it? It's like we go through these like levels of like, okay, well, we're opening a clinic for queer people, but like, is it in a neighborhood where it's like prominently like white queer people that live, you know, even though we're like working maybe with like gay men, you know, it's like we're helping white gay men. I do a lot of like work with CanFAR, who is like a huge fundraiser, like organization for HIV/AIDS research and creating access. And like a big thing that they've rolled out, like with a lot of the funding that we get, is they've like now opened up a bunch of clinics like in Scarborough and in Brampton, and they're trying to like fill in this sort of like gap to access these communities who aren't going to be in downtown Toronto going to the village to get care.
Totally.
You know?
And I do feel like it also, on top of that, there's a lot of cultural shame and stigmas surrounding this topic.
Absolutely.
So if you are somebody of color, you feel a lot of shame placed upon you. Like if you have to even go and access this care, it's almost to the point where like, and I've seen it like within myself as well, where you feel so ashamed that you don't even want to go get tested. You don't even want to go get treated, because then you're like admitting to something being like wrong with you that is not allowed to be wrong with you.
Exactly.
When you carry so much shame every single day, and there's like layers and intersectionality to shame, it just makes it so much harder to access care.
And a lot of the stories that we've told even on this podcast of like BIPOC queer experiences, it's like it's so layered with religion as well, majority of the time. And even just like going back to when we were talking about the AIDS epidemic, and a lot of that was based on like religion and immorality and like these kinds of pieces. And a lot of these folks, like they may not even be comfortable with their own identity. Layers on top of that, like you were saying as well, like financial and poverty, just being able to access these clinics and like meeting people where they're at is a huge component. And like you're saying too, the cost of medication, the cost of PrEP, it's like oftentimes applying for the funding to be able to get free medication. It's like digital literacy, being able to access a computer to be able to do all these things. Like there's so many layers to this, and that is why it's so important to have folks at the table. It's like, okay, what is actually the best way for you to be able to receive this care?
I remember when I left my job and I like had to go pick up my medication, and I knew that like the clinic that I was going to was covering like so many refills or whatever, and then my benefits ended, and then the pharmacist was like, oh, it'll be like 3,900 and blah blah blah.
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, I can't pay for that. And she was like, well, I can't give you them unless you pay for it. And I was like, okay, but like I thought the clinic was covering it. And she goes, well, like your script ran out, like if you don't have benefits, like you have to pay for it. And there was no like
warning.
There's other programs, there's things that you can apply for. Like I literally had to go do all of my own research to find like privatized funding to cover my medication. And it's just like who can afford that? Like I remember putting it on my credit card, and it took me forever to pay that off.
And now imagine being someone experiencing homelessness or experiencing all these different layers that makes your day-to-day life so much more difficult. Being able to now go and do that labor of finding these resources is so much more challenging.
Totally.
It's also a matter of like profiting off of illnesses, which is so disgusting. Like same thing with like diabetes. Like the medication for diabetes, it actually doesn't cost a lot to make, but they sell it at like 10x, 20x the cost.
So gross.
A final kind of myth, I know we touched on this about gay men being like a larger population of folks who are diagnosed with HIV, but I'm wondering if anyone can contact HIV, do you know why gay men are at higher risk?
I guess like the way that sometimes we have sex, you know, I think a lot of gay men, don't use protection. When you're having sex like anally, it's really like important that it's lubricated, and like, you know, an anus isn't like, you know, it doesn't warm up the same way as like, you know, some people's, you know, vaginas might. And there's like micro tears or things that happen like in your anus. And that's why. So it's like a direct way of the virus like going into your blood. Safer sex practices aren't happening.
So behavioral, of course. And then on top of that, it's also at this point like a numbers game as well. So it's like since the HIV epidemic started in the 1980s, like gay men have been at higher risk, like you said, because of just like the way that people have sex. And this just represents more new HIV cases. And then, of course, that puts people in a pool of people that you're having sex with. It's like it's just more likely that you're going to contract it now because that's a larger population of folks who do have it at this point. And I think with testing campaigns and educational campaigns, like you said, around PrEP and everything, it's like that number slowly starts to go down. And then you start looking at these other populations, and it's like, okay, that's where you're actually at some risk as well. Like you said, a lot of women are now at risk too.
But before we get into that, this podcast is proudly sponsored by Vizzy Hard Seltzer. And with Vizzy's vibrant flavors, you can now follow your own vibe.
For those of you who know Queer Collective, you know that Vizzy has been a longtime supporter of us and our mission to create accurate and positive representation for the entire queer community. So if you are a hard seltzer drinker, we highly recommend drinking and supporting one that you know also supports the queer community.
And now, back to the episode.
So this next section that we want to dive into is really around radical vulnerability and having courageous conversations. So I'm wondering first, what factors led you to publicly disclose your status?
A lot of factors, to be honest, because I think when I was diagnosed, I had to sort of I had to go through the physical healing. And then I realized that was actually a really short kind of part of healing once it became undetectable and my body was kind of balanced out. And it was the mental healing that I had to kind of do of experiencing something that was so traumatic for me, probably the most traumatic thing I think I've ever went through in my life. There was so much stigma and shame that I had internalized, not even realizing. And I think in order to hold myself accountable for truly loving myself in this body that is HIV positive, I needed to sort of publicly come out about my status and have sort of courageous conversations around HIV and tell the world that I was HIV positive, because I didn't know if I could do it on my own if I kept it quiet, because I just felt like it was feeding into this stigma and shame that just exists around HIV. And I'm when you really think about HIV now, it's my life didn't really change on a physical level, I get an injection every 2 months and I live whatever my normal life is, but someone with diabetes has a way worse, life of how much they have to monitor their health, and it's just unfortunate that there's still so much stigma from the 80s where, we lost over 33 million people to AIDS. I think there's still so much fear from that, that epidemic that's still happening. When I was diagnosed, I didn't know anything about HIV. I thought I was going to die. I was 27 years old and I literally was crying in a parking lot when I found out, and was wow, my life is over. There's still so much education that needs to be done around it. And that's where I think these courageous conversations has kind of led me down this path of I want to advocate for people that don't feel comfortable or have the courage to be vulnerable.
At that point, did you already have a platform on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I've been sharing my journey online since I was a teenager. I think it's just sort of where I found my community was online. So, but I think what's interesting though is I was really I would see so many people going viral and seeing so many people being so successful online. And it wasn't until, I really had started having these courageous conversations on my platform that my platform blew up, and I think it's kind of interesting because I thought the opposite at the time. I thought people were going to reject me and I was going to get canceled because I was publicly talking about HIV. I thought I was going to lose my job. There was just all of these factors, and I totally was the complete opposite. I don't think I've just experienced so much love and joy and, because of my vulnerability.
The takeaway from this really is just that vulnerability is what makes us connect to each other as human beings, because I think social media can be so cold sometimes. A lot of people get this perception that everyone is living their best life because you're only posting the highlight moments.
Totally.
Vulnerability on my own side, we've been having one of the hardest years of our life. And then one of my friends reached out to me and was just hey, how are you doing? And I was honestly, having a bad year.
Yeah.
And they're whoa, on social media, I would have thought you're thriving. It was kind of a wake up call to me that it's that's kind of what everybody's doing. Everyone's just posting their highlights. But once someone like yourself actually gets real and honest about their actual experience, that's when people are phew, we can take off this heavy weight of having to pretend all of the time. And I don't know, it also helps people get the knowledge that they need, that it's this isn't a death sentence. So you've brought something with you.
Yes.
That our partner today, DoorDash, has created something to help all of our listeners and the entire queer community help get more vulnerable and connect with each other. And I'm wondering if you can introduce it.
Absolutely. So DoorDash has launched this amazing sort of card game called Courageous Conversations. And, essentially this is something that you can just play with with your friends or your family, whoever you're with as you're enjoying food that you order off DoorDash, which is so cool. Or you can order it separately, which is pretty awesome from Dashmart if you just want it on its own, because it's it's a pretty thought-provoking game, but the way that the cards are worded, they're not intimidating or they're just really about how can you connect with the people that are around you, because I think sometimes I think about my family members or even some of my friends, where it's sometimes hard to take that first step on getting deeper with them.
Totally.
Yeah.
And this can be sort of a way that you can connect with them, because sometimes if you just drop a vulnerable question, people are put their walls up, but you're setting the premise that
we love playing card games like this. 2 months ago maybe, we literally spent 5 hours playing a card game
I
like
love it.
this
Very
where you just
similar.
ask each other like deep
Totally.
questions. It was very similar. And especially when you know somebody
Yes.
for so long, like we've known each other for
Yeah.
6 years, you're like, oh, I think I know everything about you. You start
Totally.
asking these questions and you're like, oh, I didn't expect that answer. Like
Exactly.
I'm learning new things about you. Should we
try?
Yeah. Who wants to go first?
I can go.
Okay. Okay, I'll ask
Do
you
you
the
read it to me?
question. Is that
Okay.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so your question is under the community pillar.
Mm-hmm.
So share a difficult experience in which you felt like you didn't belong. And what did the experience teach you?
It's a big question. There was an experience recently that I had at Pride, actually. And for our listeners who don't know, we've recently opened up our relationships, and I'm exploring my bisexuality for like the first time in like 7 years, because I was identifying as a lesbian for a long time. But now I have a partner who's a man, and we went to an event that I wasn't expecting to be like a gay men event, I
Yes.
guess. And it's like not normally the community that I'm
Fair.
surrounded by. It's like typically we're in like very like queer spaces,
Yes.
lesbian spaces. We got a lot of like negative comments. Like I feel it, to me in my heart, I'm like, I read as queer. Like
Yes.
my whole life surrounds queerness. I'm like, I
Totally.
feel like I signal queerness, and I also feel like my partner does too. He's also queer. And then we were just getting a lot of like negativity, like some people saying like, what are they queer? And like mean things of just like, why are they taking up our space?
No
like,
way.
yeah. And like once we touched each other, they're like, oh, knew it. Like these kind like loud enough for us to hear. It hurt. At first, I was like, oof, like this feels like it's supposed to be my space. This feels like it's supposed to be my community. And I feel like excluded. After leaving that experience, I was like, you know what? The truth is like, I do belong in these spaces. And the people who we speak to, like our listeners, they're constantly telling us how seen we make them feel around like their bisexuality, their queerness, when a lot of people who are queer are in straight passing
Yes,
relationships, whether you're
absolutely.
trans, gender nonconforming. Like there's so many reasons that your
Totally.
relationship can look straight passing. And all of those experiences are valid, and all of them are welcome at Pride, at queer events, anywhere you go. And I just like realized that I wasn't the one in the wrong there. They were in the wrong there. And like it kind of more so motivated me to keep going with our conversations that we're having on this podcast. It's like, okay, there's a lot more learning that our community needs to do. And like that's what I'm going to take away from it.
Absolutely. And it's so unfortunate because when you like look at like our acronym or our
Yeah.
flag, it's like
Yeah.
supposed to be about this like community of coming together, but there's so much segregation.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
like people, it's like weird when people don't want different groups to blend together. And I'm like, this
Yeah.
makes no sense to me.
Yeah. Who's next?
Do you want to go?
Okay, it's me.
Okay. Okay, so yours falls under the individuality pillar. What have you learned about yourself over the last year?
No matter what situation you're in, relationship you're in, etc., like you need to date yourself consistently and like never stop, regardless of like if you start dating other people or not. Like you really need to continue to get to know yourself better. Those moments of like solitude and just like getting to know you, who you are as a person, and continuing that journey is so important, because it's so easy to get lost if you stop doing that.
Not only just like making time to like date I've been in a relationship now for almost 4 years, and it's like there's that like dating myself, but also like remembering to date your friends
Yeah,
too. Like I'm
so
like,
true.
I'm like, oh, especially
Yeah.
now that I don't live in the
Yeah.
city, I feel like I've all of my friendships have just been like flipped upside down, and I'm like, okay, like how am I still giving you love and affection? I think it's such a big eye opener.
Okay, I think it's time for you to answer a question.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it easier to love others than to love yourself? If so, why?
Honestly, I feel like this is my like Achilles heel a bit, I think in who I am as a person. I think as a young queer person, I think I really struggled with like loving myself and just really understanding what that looks like and how that should be, because I just felt like who I was always like rejected. So like it was really hard for me to love who I was. As a part of like my coping to, I think, my pain and my shame, it was so much easier to love other people,
Yeah.
But then I think as you grow up and you get into bad relationships, you have bad friendships that are toxic, you realize that you can't like love someone else until you actually like fully love and understand who you are. And I think that was like a really big learning. So, I'm really glad to say that I think now it is a lot easier for me to love myself and like have those boundaries, but it took a long time. And,
Yeah.
I remember getting out of my last long-term relationship before I met Tyler, and I was single for, almost 4 years, because it's like, I needed to commit to myself of like understanding and who I was and get really uncomfortable with loving ourselves. And I don't think we realize like how hard that actually is.
And going back to like dating yourself
Yes.
and like really understanding yourself and loving yourself is so important.
Totally.
Yeah, because I feel like for me, it's so easy for me to give a lot of myself to other people, but then really difficult to give that to me.
Yes.
And again, you can get like so lost in that.
Agreed. I think it's just so much easier to do like kind things for other people, you know, when we're feeling discomfort. Oftentimes, I think our discomfort is like one of the greatest teachers. And I think some of the biggest things and the most transformative things I've had in my life has been when I finally have sat with like what makes me so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Your body is trying to show you something.
Yes.
If you're
Yeah.
uncomfortable, it's because there's something you need to look at.
And we shouldn't be afraid of it.
Yeah, it's very true. And this year, especially in terms of like my own body image, I've done a lot of work of like just how I feel about myself and like my own self-confidence and like the way that I talk to myself, especially. And I find like, I'm like, wow, for the first time, I actually really love myself, and sitting with myself isn't scary. Like I used to be scared to be alone. And now that I'm not judging myself, I have zero judgment for other people.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And that allows you to access this different kind of love that is like so much deeper, and it's just like it's so much more raw and authentic. I find being able to love somebody like no matter what, I think is really beautiful. For our friends listening at home, if they also want to access this DoorDash free therapy in a box, courageous conversations, how can they find it?
Absolutely. So you can like literally just add it on to your DoorDash food order, or like if you want to order it directly right through DashMart.
And it's absolutely free.
Yes, exactly. You don't have to pay for it.
Nice. And we'll have the link in the description as well for people to access it if they want to order them as well.
So what are some invisible ways that society discriminates against folks with HIV?
When I'm dealing with medical professionals, you know, like I like just yesterday, I go get my routine blood work done, and you know, someone looks at my chart. And then you like see their face change, and then you like see them go grab like extra gloves. Like they're doing like double layers of gloves, or they're treating you like you have an infectious disease.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I feel
even they're not educated in the medical
and these
professionals.
are like, you know, people, literally nurses or whatever. Yeah, like dentist office. Like I've had people like I've disclosed it and they'll just like completely ghosted me about like an appointment. Or I've like asked, like I filled out their intake form and then they just like won't send me an appointment date. Obviously, like dating, like prior to me being HIV positive, you know, I was in my slut era and, you know, I was living my best life and whatever, like figuring out what I enjoyed. Yeah. And as soon as I like I put HIV positive on my, like on my profiles or like disclose that to people, it's just like, people don't want to touch you.
Right.
And that has gotten better, but like, you know, it's still unfortunate. Like,
of course.
I remember being on a date with someone. It was just like a first date, but like I knew like it wasn't going to be anything, and I felt like it was like hookup vibes. And so I brought him back to my place, and we were making out, and you know, kind of getting hot and heavy. And then I was like, okay, like I need to tell you something. Like I'm HIV positive. And I remember he like looked at me. And it was like I murdered him. And he started like getting like very verbally abusive and started freaking out at me. And I'm like, I have this person in my like home. I was like, I thought he was going to beat the shit out of me. And I had to like get him out of my house. He was like, I can't believe you wouldn't tell me. And like
I'm doing
I was like,
that right now.
Yeah. Like, and I'm like, trying to educate him. And he's like, you gave me HIV. And like was just like losing his mind. And I'm like, no, that's not possible. Even if I bled on you, like in an open wound, like that wouldn't happen. I'm undetectable. And like, you know, but he just like didn't want to hear it. And like, you know, eventually I got him out of my home, but it was just like, it was so scary. Like, so, you know, there's just like a lot of these things that unspokenly can kind of happen, like it escalates so quickly into like other things too.
That's so sad that people's perception of you as like a person change.
Yes, totally.
Like you're written with disease and like they can't touch you, they can't speak to you. Like you lie to them, you deceive them, like all of these different things where actually you were trying to be very honest with them. And you were just trying to have like a regular conversation, educate them. And also you hadn't done anything to them.
Now, like the way the law goes, like being undetectable, like I really don't have to like disclose my status. Right. And you think about it, like anyone that you meet on your first date or if like you're hooking up, like are you like, I have diabetes, I have high blood pressure. You're not telling them any of this shit. Like it's just like, I don't necessarily think that like, you know, where HIV is now, like if you are undetectable, like you don't necessarily like have to disclose that. I don't think you're putting anyone at any risk that you have to like necessarily go through that. But it's because of the stigma and shame that I feel like I have to disclose. People would look at that as betrayal, even though I'm not putting them at risk.
Do you think people should care if someone they're dating discloses to them that they have HIV?
I don't think they should. Because again, like I always like tell people that like have, you know, a bit of an issue with it or whatever. Like I can see them like getting activated when it is disclosed. Is you have to understand, like, if I don't take care of my health, I'll die.
Right.
So by you having sex with me, you're probably having sex with like one of the safest people you could possibly have sex with. Because like I don't want to die. So like I'm taking care of myself. You don't know about the random who says that they don't have HIV.
True.
You don't know what their history is. Like I literally, like, you know, when I was single, I was getting tested like every single month for STIs because it's just like I'm so hyper fixated on my health and like maintaining my health because I'm not ashamed anymore of like taking care of my sexual health because I've healed through that. But you don't know how everyone else is. Most people are still living in their shame around their sexuality and health, regardless if they're out or not, you know?
That's so true. That's such a good point. The random person that is like presumably healthy.
Totally.
Or they would assume that they're healthy just because like, you know, nothing's coming up for them in terms of like, I don't feel anything. Like they could totally have something that's just 100%. Like they're unaware of.
Exactly.
And they're going around living their life, like not disclosing anything to anybody, not getting tested. And they're actually technically more of a danger or more of a risk.
Absolutely. When I would be messaging guys on Grindr, and I'd be like, when was the last time you got tested? They'd be like 6 months ago, 8 months ago.
That's so long ago.
And I'm like,
too long.
You're on Grindr. Like, I know you're hooking up with people every week. Like, don't. Like, 8 months. Like,
for me, show me a photo. Like, I
show
want to
me
see
the
your test
results.
Totally.
with the date.
I feel you. Because it's just like, people are not taking it seriously. And that's why like you have like freaking super chlamydia going around right now because no one's taking care of it.
And I really think the only thing that makes it so stigmatized too is the fact that it's associated with sex as well. Even when we're thinking about something like herpes, like lots of people have the exact same virus on their mouth and it's not stigmatized at all. Like children have it, you can get it in so many different ways. That exact same virus, if you were to give someone head while you have it, would give them genital herpes.
Totally.
And then that is something that is highly stigmatized just because it's associated with the sex act. There's lots of new research now, if all of us are actually getting properly educated, that you can engage with safe sex with people who have had like STIs, like HIV, like HPV as well. Like there's lots of ways to engage with people. And typically, like you said, those people who have been diagnosed, they've been in the clinic, they've had these conversations with healthcare professionals, and they know how to engage with safe sex with you, especially if they're bringing it to you. That means like they value your health and they're having that conversation with you because they care about you.
Exactly.
Especially after that dangerous situation where someone was like confronting you in your home. How do you navigate disclosing having HIV now?
Yeah, I mean, it changed after that moment because I didn't disclose until I felt comfortable with people. And like from that moment on, it was like one of the first things I said to anyone that I was like knew that we were going to hook up or like potentially go on a date with, because it was easier for me to like walk away from something that I don't know or and I'm not familiar with and I'm not emotionally connected with versus like waiting until after, because I think sometimes the longer you wait, the harder it is.
Totally. It's like, oh, dang, I actually liked you.
Exactly. And then also that person too, it gives them more time to like maybe feel like you betrayed them because that's their emotional story, you know?
And they can do some research.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's one of the things with sex that I think maybe it's changed the way I look at sex. The person that I am like letting in to like have this sort of like exchange with, like I think that needs to be like respected and I need to honor my body and who I am. And like, why do I want to have sex with someone who doesn't want to respect me? You know?
True. Yeah.
It was hard to kind of get that because I think a lot of, you know, queer people, I think sex is a way that we validate like ourselves. And I definitely know, like I used it to numb, I think a lot of my pain and shame and, you know, regardless of, you know, being sober, I think sex sort of like overtook a lot of like what I was using substances for and navigating that boundary and that respect that I'm giving to myself sexually too.
What's a positive way to respond to someone after they've just disclosed their status to you?
What initially comes to mind for me would be, oh, thank you for telling me.
Yes.
I have questions.
Yeah.
Just to get more informed, especially if I'm not already. Can it be transmitted? Are you undetectable? Like all these different little pieces that you would want to know for your own health and safety and then for their health and safety. But then also after digesting all of that information, doing some researching of my own, and then just being like, okay, like you respect me and my health.
Mm-hmm.
I respect you and your health. And it's totally fine. That's just my take on it.
I think one of the ones is like that I think oftentimes we forget is whether it's like about race or like talking about like health. It's like, do you have the capacity to talk about this with me? I really want to encourage people to like ask that permission.
Yeah.
Baby HIV Myles, like I didn't have the capacity to have these conversations with people. I just wanted to have sex. And like and so like going through having to like educate that other person, it was really
labor.
exhausting.
Yeah.
And, because then oftentimes it would be like multiple people in a night of trying to look for a hookup of like having these conversations with. And like,
that is exhausting.
It is.
Yeah,
it's
that's a
lot.
good point.
So,
Totally.
I really like asking permission because then like, then you can follow that up with like, do you have like, if you don't like, do you have a website or somewhere I could like find this information or something like that, So
totally.
Yeah.
And I think another thing to add to that is that a lot of the time, especially because the stigma, when somebody's disclosing this information to you, they're being very vulnerable with you. So also just like understanding that they are now vulnerable and like treating them with like extra care and compassion and support.
Would you recommend that people like put it in their dating profile? Like just...
I mean, I did, but like, I was so comfortable with it that I could. For hookup websites, I definitely recommend it because I think it'll just like help navigating it a lot, make it a lot easier for you. And you're not gonna have to deal with a lot more bullshit.
So to leave folks off with a really strong understanding of HIV AIDS, especially after like this whole conversation, it's like, let's make sure we all know what the hell we're talking about. I'm wondering if we can provide some comprehensive sex education.
I
what do we all
love comprehensive
think?
sex ed.
So what I wanted to start to kind of prime everybody is to talk about the 3 stages of HIV infection. I found learning about this really helped me distinguish between like what is AIDS and what's HIV,
It
which
gets confusing.
Honestly, a lot of people don't really know. So the first stage is an acute HIV infection, and this is when the virus is developing after 2 to 3 weeks of being infected. This is the earliest stage, and this is when the virus is spreading quite quickly. So you're going to be developing flu-like symptoms, a rash, a headache, those kinds of things. And then the second stage is the chronic stage. This is kind of probably where you were at when you realized that you had it. And this is when the HIV continues to multiply in your body, but at a much lower rate. So you're not going to have those like initial symptoms, but like you said, you're probably going to have like your immune system is getting really impacted. So you're going to feel sicker for longer and be kind of confused in that way.
And I think just to add to like phase 1 and phase 2 is that like every person, it can be different. Yeah. And sometimes phase 1 can like take up to 3 months for it to even for you to test positive like on a test. Yeah. So it's just like it is important. Really? Yeah. Everyone's immune system like reacts differently to the virus. So make sure you give yourself like a 3-month grace period if you think you might have come in contact with HIV. So.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So if left untreated for approximately 8 to 10 years, but like you said, everyone's immune system is different. This is when it advances to the 3rd stage, which is AIDS. And that's where it's distinguished between HIV and AIDS. And AIDS is very serious. It has grown and developed to the point where your immune system is completely destroyed. Basically, you can't fight off any infections. You have less than 200 white blood cells, which we Googled it right before this because Carmen's like, what's the regular amount? Yeah. And it's like, what, like 1,000, 4,000?
No, it's like 4,000 to 11,000.
Totally.
Yeah. Which that is drastic.
So significant.
Imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is when you have a strong possibility of transferring the virus and you have approximately 3 years left to live, which is very sad. But at where we're at now with like medical advancements, no one really should be advancing to the stage of AIDS.
There is people that I've known that have, due to their own personal like reasons, like didn't want to take the medication and like it ended up going into AIDS. But I think once they were able to go on medication, it was actually able to reverse it.
Oh, really?
Which is pretty amazing to see and be able to witness that firsthand.
Wow.
So it really shows how powerful I think this medication is and life-saving it can be. So
that's incredible.
Yeah.
A lot of people have just like their own uncomfortabilities around like medical healthcare systems as well that can like prevent them from accessing healthcare.
Totally.
And you see that with like many different conditions too. Like there's a lot of people who like delay and wait to take care of their bodies. And we've been talking about this like throughout the whole episode of just like prioritizing your own health and that being something that like our society oftentimes we like fly under the radar. It's like, well, you have all these symptoms, but it's just like ignoring and ignoring and ignoring.
Totally.
So one thing I found is that there is 5 fluids that can contain enough HIV to transmit. Of course, like you said, like blood is the main thing. It's much less likely, like you said, but it can also be transmitted with semen, even pre-cum, vaginal fluid, anal mucus. When we wrote that down, I was like, I'm going to say that into the mic. anal mucus. And breast milk. So another thing is people can be born with HIV and it can be transmitted through breast milk. But I think one thing I was finding too is that when you're non-transmittable now, mothers with HIV are able to breastfeed again, which is huge.
And also have babies that don't have HIV.
Yeah.
So
which is really, really huge. But one thing is it's not saliva.
Yes.
Which is like a huge misconception.
Yeah.
Okay. So Myles,
Yes.
I'm going to throw this one at you. I feel like it's an easy one and you'll be able to do this. How can individuals protect themselves from contracting the virus?
Absolutely. So, taking a medication called PrEP, so pre-exposure prophylaxis, is a really great way. It's like a pill that you're supposed to take it every single day. A lot of people, like, if they know that they're going to have sex coming up, they'll like take it like 2 days before and then 2 days after to
and it like kicks in.
It's kind of like an intense dosage. We don't recommend that, but a lot of people practice that. That you can take every day. Obviously, condoms are an easy way to have safer sex as well, and and then making sure that you just know your status and getting tested routinely. Not every 8 months, is like just a really another great way to protect yourself.
100%. Yeah, just practicing safer sex and like safe hookups in general. We are definitely slut positive on this podcast. We love a good slut. But yeah, like asking people for their test results and like making sure that you're hooking up with people who hold the same like values of like safer sex that you do and like engaging with those people. Because like you said, it's like, why would you want to share your body in such a vulnerable way with someone who isn't respecting it?
100%.
And like respecting your health is a huge part of like respecting your body.
Yeah. If you can go to the gym, you can go get an STI test.
There
It's easy.
you go.
It's easy.
One of the last questions, what does treatment look like for folks who are HIV positive?
Yeah, so there's kind of two types of treatment that are available now. So there is like a pill form that you take a pill or multiple pills every day, depending on like which strain of HIV you have. Some are a little bit more aggressive than others, so sometimes people need like a combination of pills to in order to like make it undetectable. And then now they have like an injectable version, which is great because I get an injection like every 2 months, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's so much nicer.
That sounds way better because I'm bad at even just taking vitamins.
Oh my gosh, same. I am like the type of person when I'm tired, it's just like it's like someone like turns off the switch. So if I didn't take my pills before I went to bed, I'm like, I just completely forgot. So it definitely helps I find the injection is way better for giving you like a broader protection, and less room for human error.
And also just like simplifying your life. I'm sure it can be like a constant reminder too for people who are like newly diagnosed. It's like taking your medication is reminding you like every day of this thing that's drastically changed your life. And doing something like once every 2 months isn't as drastic of a change of like constantly having to take a medication.
Exactly.
Were you able to switch to that because you were already undetectable?
Yes, but I believe that you can like start on it as well. I just know that you have to get it like more frequently at the beginning versus like waiting every 2 months until like you get there. So I know a lot of people will do the pills first and then switch over to the injection. It just depends on like where your levels are at, I think.
Our last question for you is, how can our listeners support your mission and get involved in HIV advocacy?
Really just getting out there. I'm sure you all learned a lot today on this podcast episode, but there's so much more information, that you can learn and get out there. You're welcome. I definitely recommend checking out like sexfluent.ca. I think it's an amazing platform of just like empowerment around sexual health and mental health and harm reduction. You can obviously follow me on TikTok and Instagram at Myles with a Y, and then Sexton is my last name. And I'm really trying to like help educate people on creating safer spaces, using inclusive language, even to things around like working with brands on like gender neutral fashion and how to like make your like business more inclusive. So I've developed like a bunch of different training programs, and like right now I'm just in the process of like digitizing all of it. People can either take like my in-person or like my virtual class, and then like they also can get like a membership to my portal, get the rest of their employees to take the training programs, and everything will be like on video.
Amazing.
So yeah, I'm really excited. Social media is ever changing, and I'm
Sure is.
really dedicated on like how do I make the most impact. And I think through conversation and storytelling and training is a really great way to do that.
So thank you so much, Myles, for joining us today. It was so lovely speaking with you. And for our listeners at home, if you want to dive deeper into sex education, we have an entire episode on it with Eva Bloom. So click the video on the left or make sure that you check it out in the description down below. Make sure that you hit subscribe and like the video. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, make sure to leave us a 5-star review because it really does help the podcast out. That's everything that we got. And until next time, peace.